Hello, everyone. This is Heidi Hartmann, President of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. We're delighted to present to you our second in our spring series of webinars on the issue of family supportive policies for workers and the health effects of same. And we are delighted to have the sponsorship of this project, which we are doing jointly with the University of California-Berkeley from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It is part of their Policies for Action program, which is managed by the Urban Institute. And we're delighted to have the cooperation of the Urban Institute and the Foundation today as well. We have a wonderful set of presenters today and a very interesting topic, one that is not as well known as some of the others, but very important, and we're seeing some of it in action right now with the coronavirus situation. The topic is work supports and health, work scheduling. As I said, our entire series is about supports for working families and how they contribute to the well-being of families, both in terms of their health and their economic status. So I'm going to just briefly mention all the speakers and then introduce our first presenter. The presenters today are Lonnie Golden from Penn State University, Kristin Harknett from the University of California, Rachel Lyons from the United Food and Commercial Workers, and Bridget Schulte from the Better Life Lab at New America. Starting with Lonnie Golden, he is a professor of economics and labor and employment relations at Abington College at Penn State University. He's an affiliate with the Project for Middle Class Renewal at the University of Illinois, and he works also with the Employment Insecurity Network at the University of Chicago and the ILO in Geneva and the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. His subject matter is the trends, patterns, and determinants and consequences of hours of work and non-standard employment in labor markets, organizations, households, and for individuals. He focuses on part-time work, underemployment, and overemployment mismatches, overtime work scheduling, workplace flexibility, and outcomes such as health, earnings gaps, happiness, and time conflicts. Lonnie, it is a pleasure to have you today. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Heidi. Thanks for including me. Wonderful to be here with the IWPR. So what I'll do today is a little overview and a little summary of the ongoing research I have going with my wonderful collaborators, Jason Kim at South Carolina, at the University of Illinois Project for Middle Class Renewal, and Adam Okulich-Kazaran at Rutgers Camden. Next slide. So when we think about work scheduling and some of the consequences associated with it, try to think of a continuum or a spectrum of those of us that have control over our time or periodically do, and those of us that have no control or periodically do not have any control. So on one end of the spectrum is having time sovereignty. On the other end of the spectrum is having variability in our work time, and compromise situations in the middle where maybe we all have just a regular fixed schedule and fixed hours that's relatively predictable. And all points in between. Next slide, please. So I'm a labor economist, so we start with the Economist foundation that our well-being can be captured in a variable called utility, and what feeds into that are the things that we're now trying to measure more as like health and happiness, satisfaction with life. But the idea is we get well-being that stems from our income and it stems from our non-work time and leisure time that's part of that. But it also depends on, if we expand this model that we start with, the timing of work. That matters. And in particular, the gap between what we desire in terms of the number of hours and the timing of our hours with our actual hours. In economics, that's referred to as hours constraints. In other social sciences, it's referred to as mismatches or incongruence. And having the ability, the control to transition between these different uses of time and make adjustments to our work time is what's also crucial. So what the literature tends to do, if anybody who's involved in this space, is focus in on some of the problematic areas of work hours and schedules, which of course are all being amplified now in the COVID-19 crisis, And of course, there's also these interactions among them. So the things I'll be focusing on is this periodic, if not chronic, inadequacy of hours that we refer to as underemployment, and the instability of hours, which can create that situation where hours are volatile in an unwelcome way. And for hourly workers, often involves the volatility of their earnings as well. And then there's this unpredictability of not knowing when you're going to work and for how long you're going to work on short notice, and that we call unpredictability. And finally, the inflexibility of our hours and schedules, where on the one end of the spectrum we can control that timing. On the other hand, maybe we don't have responsiveness to changes in our desired hours and schedules. Next slide. So why should we care? There's a literature which looks at this relationship between work schedules, in particular that experience of working too few or too many hours, and the association between that and aspects of our well-being, however measured, usually self-reported general health or a battery of questions reflecting health, mental health, physical health. Mental health seems to matter more than physical health when it comes to scheduling issues. And then the extreme cases of psychological distress like depression and the things that feed into it like poor sleep quality. And then a separate but overlapping literature about work to family, time conflict, and job dissatisfaction or general life dissatisfaction or unhappiness. Now, a conventional labor economics approach discounts, if not outright diminishes this, because we assume that jobs generate, for these poor working conditions of not having control over your hours, for example, the compensating wage differences that we're now seeing in the talk about hero pay or hazard pay. But the evidence is pretty scant that people who work these inconvenient, unsocial hours, with some exception, do not tend to get a boost or premium in their pay for that. And as a matter of fact, in the ongoing surveys that we're doing right now, we're finding that both underemployment and overemployment mismatches are escalating. And so the findings of the literature are accented even more. Next slide, please. So typically we look at the indicators of the hours inadequacy, questions and surveys about irregular versus regular shift times, having to work on call, and then look at some of the outcomes which are related to health, which is mental health, work stress, work-family conflict, unhappiness, and also underemployment itself as an outcome. Next slide. So for a recent survey that we did at the Project for Middle Class Renewal at University of Illinois, for example, we looked at those who have on-call shifts and find that they have significantly higher rates among the part-time workers and those on temps or independent contracts than people who have full-time regular employment. And it's more concentrated among hourly than salaried people as well. Next slide. And that same survey, at least among all those who work on call, at least sometimes, if not regularly, their rate of underemployment or that feeling that their income is inadequate is a majority of the work in that category at 56% versus a smaller 44% among those who never do work on an on-call basis. Next slide, please. For related evidence that working on an irregular schedule is related to the underemployment, the work we're doing with Jason Kim using the general social surveys, which come out biannually, they one year had a question about scheduling, and in particular that they have a schedule where the working times are decided by their employer on short notice. And you can see this smooth gradation, at least in our descriptive results here, that the more the irregular their schedule, the higher their rate or experience of underemployment. Next slide, please. In our more recent survey that we're just starting to analyze at University of Illinois, we have relationships, let's say, between this part-time and temporary situation of work. Relative to full-timers, they tend to regard their own health as relatively poor or fair, whereas people with standard full-time employment arrangements regard their health as excellent or very good. Thanks. Next slide. What about the work-family time conflict? We have this also smooth gradation between working irregular shifts that are not as predictable or on call rolled in with that. So the more irregular one shift and the more non-daytime one shift, the more they experience work-family time conflict. All else, well, we'll control for other things in a moment. Next slide, please. So our next step in the research literature has been to try to control for all the other confounding factors that might, like people's jobs, like people's personal family situations, their demographics. And when you control for all that, what do we find? Yes, indeed, people that work on irregular on-call shifts tend to be associated positively with more frequent experience of work stress. They also are more frequently experiencing the work-family time conflict. And this is intensified, particularly for those in the industries that Kristin and Dan Schneider focus on in retail, health, and food services. And when people are working part-time, it somewhat tampers down the degree to which they get work-family conflict from their irregular work schedules for split and rotating shifts, so that there are some interaction effects. But we can't rule out in cross-sectional data the fact that a lot of things are occurring simultaneously. There are these strong associations, but it might be this endogeneity problem that people with irregular or people with health issues or job or stress or time conflict are more prone to it. They choose to take, get, or stay in jobs that have such schedules. Next slide. In addition, with other cross-sectional data that will be released by the Center for Law and Social Policy, we have executive summaries out. But in any case, this work is showing with the General Social Survey attachment in 2016 that when we devised novel ways of defining involuntary part-time work, being part-time and underemployed, tends to, relative to voluntary part-time workers, accentuate people's work stress and accentuate people's work-family time conflict. Next slide, please. When we try to get at that endogeneity problem using SIP data with Jason Kim, where you have some preliminary results that show that people's self-reported health, in particular their mental health over the last 30 days, is significantly lower to the degree of 30% lower odds of experiencing good mental health days when they work part-time and it's involuntary. When they work part-time and it's voluntary, it's actually something that promotes better health. So it's that involuntary dimension which is crucial. In addition, when people work the non-traditional schedules, not so much as expected with the irregular shift, but when people work evenings or nights, they tend to have relatively poor self-rated health. Next slide. The work with the General Social Survey with Adam Okulich-Kazaran is finding, using the data that Susan Lambert, my colleague at University of Chicago, has gotten on these surveys, the closer the shortest is to one's usual working week, the higher is their happiness, and to an even greater extent, the longer the working week is compared to their usual working week is, the lower is their happiness associated with that. Next slide. So our main takeaways are going to be that irregular scheduling has some adverse effects on their own, but because they're frequently associated with underemployment, those effects compound each other. They're both associated with mental health issues, higher work stress, and more frequent work-family time conflict. In particular, those who work part-time, the underemployment effects are pernicious to these indicators of well-being, and it's about their involuntariness mainly. When hours are unstable, this also affects their well-being. And finally, there's these negative consequences. So maybe we can start to address this with innovative policies. So next and last slide will be the ways in which policymakers and policy advocates have been trying to create public, not just private organizational ways of attenuating some of these adverse consequences and the scheduling practices that lead to them with the Part-Time Workers' Bill of Rights and the Fair Work Week at the state and local levels, called by different names in different localities, that include a provision where people who are underemployed can be the first ones to grab additional available work hours when we get the V-shaped recovery we're all hoping for in the future months, so that people that are involuntary part-time can get back to work full-time. But it also includes provisions that would allow people to request more permanent reductions or increases in their work hours and changes to their work schedules. That's my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lonnie. Perfect timing. I now have the pleasure of introducing Kristin Harknett. She's an associate professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California at San Francisco. Before that, she was an associate professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. She received her PhD in sociology from Princeton University. With Daniel Schneider, she co-directs the SHIFT project, which collects survey data from workers in the service sector to map the connections between schedule instability and worker health and well-being. Kristin.
Thanks, Heidi. It's great to be here today. I'll be sharing some research from the SHIFT project on how unstable schedules in the service sector spill over to affect children's care arrangements. The SHIFT project, as Heidi mentioned, is directed by Daniel Schneider and myself. And a paper I'll be drawing on in the talk is co-authored with Sigrid Lur, a graduate student finishing up at Berkeley. Next slide. The SHIFT project aims to monitor the changing nature of work and its consequences. The broad background and motivation for the project is a rise in insecurity for workers, part of a risk shift that has left workers more vulnerable. We've seen a large contraction of relatively good jobs in the manufacturing sector over the past few decades, and a concomitant growth in jobs in the service sector. And the service sector has a concentration of quintessential bad jobs, jobs that have low pay and few fringe benefits. The aspect of service sector work I'll focus on in this talk is just-in-time scheduling, what Lonnie referred to as the unpredictability dimension. So these are schedules that are assigned or changed at the last minute, giving workers little opportunity to plan their lives. And for working parents, this means little time to plan care for their young children. Next slide. From prior research, we know that stable and high-quality child care arrangements are important for child development. We know that low-income parents often have difficulty accessing high-quality care, and that non-standard work shifts, meaning work in the evenings or at nights, can be challenging for parents. But we know far less about unstable and unpredictable work schedules because we don't have a lot of data on these schedule dimensions. However, there is some research that shows instability in work schedules lead to work-family conflict, as Lonnie just showed, and gets in the way of parent involvement. And we have good reason to expect that unstable work schedules may be bad for children. The picture on this slide comes from a New York Times story illustrating just that. The Starbucks worker pictured here with her young son had to cobble together a complicated patchwork of care for her son, leading to routine instability and uncertainty in his life and in his routines. Next slide. The SHIFT project aims to fill a gap in data on work schedule instability and unpredictability in the service sector. And the service sector is large. It comprises almost 20% of jobs in the U.S. economy. In the SHIFT project, we collect survey data from service sector workers using advertisements on Facebook targeted to workers at particular named companies. This slide shows an example of an ad targeted to a CVS worker. Those who click on the ad are taken to our Qualtrics survey. They're invited to complete our survey for either a lottery incentive or for a gift card. Next slide. Over the past 4 years, the SHIFT project has collected data from over 100,000 service sector workers at over 120 large named companies. An example of our online survey is shown in the middle of this slide, and some of the companies included in our sample are shown on the right. For more detail on our data collection methods and how we validated the data that we collect using this method, I have listed the title of a 2019 article co-authored with Danny Schneider and myself in sociological methods and research. Next slide. The SHIFT project database includes national data collected over the past 4 years. It also includes oversamples in particular cities and states that have passed Fair Workweek legislation. And finally, we have linked employer-employee data that allow us to describe practices at particular employers. Next slide. For our paper on child care arrangements, we focus on the over 3,600 parents with children between the ages of 0 and 9 years in our national sample, who we surveyed in 2017 or 2018. Next slide. Among these parents, exposure to just-in-time scheduling was common. 28% of these parents reported being asked to be on call for work. This means that they held their schedule open and then found out day of whether they were needed for work. And a whopping 68% of these parents reported that their employer changed their schedule at the last minute, either asking them to stay late, come in early, or perhaps work an entirely different shift. All of this adds up to a great deal of uncertainty for parents and for their children. Next slide. As many of you know, it's hard to arrange child care that's quality, high quality, and safe, even under the best of circumstances. And as you might imagine, at the last minute, it's extremely difficult to set up care that's both safe and developmentally enriching for children. So in our work, we look at how exposure to just-in-time work schedules, that is the on-call work, and the last-minute schedule changes, are related to child care arrangements. Next slide. And what we find is summarized here. The right bar in each pair represents parents who work on call and experience these last-minute schedule changes. So these are the parents exposed to just-in-time scheduling. The left bar of each pair are their counterparts who are not exposed to just-in-time schedules. And what we find is that just-in-time work schedules increase the number of care arrangements that children are exposed to, and thus care complexity. We find that just-in-time schedules increase each type of informal care arrangement, care from grandparents or other relatives, babysitters, and siblings. But most concerning, we find that just-in-time schedules increase the chance that a child is left by him or herself without supervision. Just-in-time schedules increase unsupervised care from 2% to 4% and increase the chance that a child is left alone or with another young child increases from 5% to 8% when parents work just-in-time schedules. Next slide. The Washington Center for Equitable Growth produced a charticle based on this research highlighting some of the policy relevant findings. So here punctuating that finding that just-in-time schedules lead to more care complexity. And this is important because we know that children benefit from care arrangements that are consistent and stable. And just-in-time schedules make that extremely hard. Next slide. And from that same charticle, this is an illustration of the impact of the just-in-time schedules on kids being left without a mature caregiver to supervise them. And our estimates are that just-in-time schedules increase by about 6 days the chance that the time that children are left without a mature caregiver. Next slide. So we've shown that parents' unpredictable work schedules have consequences for children's care arrangements. Well, what can be done about these scheduling practices? As Lonnie mentioned at the end of his time, before the coronavirus outbreak, several states and several cities had begun to pass and enact legislation requiring at least 2 weeks of advance notice of work schedules or extra pay for schedules that are assigned with shorter notice. Next slide. Using SHIFT project data, we were able to evaluate one such policy in Seattle, the Secure Scheduling Ordinance. And what we found was that this law had its intended effects after 1 year. It increased workers receiving at least 2 weeks of advance notice, and also increased pay that the workers received when their schedules were changed at the last minute. Next slide. However, the coronavirus outbreak is a massive shock to the economy as a whole and has hit the service sector particularly hard. And we now face a crossroads. On the one hand, businesses are hurting and pressuring states and cities to postpone or pause their Fair Workweek legislation. If this happens, we may see a reversal of some of the gains in schedule predictability. At the same time, this time of upheaval could be a time of opportunity. The crisis has revealed the importance of the work that service sector workers do, and also the precarity that these workers face, and has created some momentum to remake our economy in a way that raises the floor and improves conditions for workers. There's also some momentum behind strengthening protections from our safety net. But time will tell whether the scale tips more towards retrenchment and a loss of progress or towards a new deal for workers. The SHIFT project will continue to monitor conditions for service sector workers both during the coronavirus outbreak and hopefully during the recovery. And so we're currently collecting data and asking workers about health and safety measures in workplaces, access to paid leave, whether children's school or care arrangements are closed. We ask about layoffs and furloughs and access to UI benefits. In the summer and the fall, we'll follow up with an occupational cohort we first interviewed last year to see how they're managing. Next slide. And I'll end by thanking our project staff and our funders, and I'll look forward to any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristin. Again, like Lonnie's, very, very interesting research results that we have here today. Let me assure everyone that you have an opportunity to ask questions in the chat box on your webinar screen. Jeff Hayes will be monitoring that later in the proceedings. So right now I'm going to call on our next two presenters. First, Rachel Lyons, who is with the United Food and Commercial Workers, as I mentioned, where she handles their legislative agenda for many different issues. She has worked previously with the National Partnership for Women and Families. Many of us worked with her when she was in that role, working on paid sick days, paid family medical leave, and fair scheduling. And she's worked for a whole range of other nonprofits as well as on political campaigns, which is really great experience to have if you want to be in public policy. It helps you understand how elected officials think about policy. Rachel earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Colorado at Boulder and a Master of Arts in Philosophy and Social Policy from the George Washington University. Rachel, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Heidi. Hello, everyone. Can I be heard?
Yes.
All right. Just making sure that, as we all do everything remotely now, can you hear me becomes one of the standards. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me onto this. I'm glad to talk about a subject that I've worked on for many years, fair scheduling and issues. I'm going to delve in more into the laws and policies that have resulted from the research that Lonnie and Kristin are talking about at the federal and state level, and a little bit about the union and what we are doing, like sort of why are we in this space at all. So next slide, please. So just a little UFCW 101, United Food and Commercial Workers is the largest private sector grocery union in the country. We are 1.3 million members. We're in every state and every congressional district and Canada. That's how we can call ourselves an international union. We're most well known as the grocery store union, and we represent the brand names that are the brand national chains such as Safeway, Giant, Kroger's, Vons and Ralph's, and other big chains. We also represent non-food retail such as Macy's and CVS, and meat processing, swine, beef, and poultry, and that's been a big part of the conversation of late. We also represent cannabis, the emerging cannabis industry, chemical, distillers, senior health care facilities, some public sector workers as well. So we are broad. And as a result, and then we have a lot of issues of interest that come out of our membership. We also, our union is about nearly 50% female, about 40% people of color, and they're all supporting families on their salaries and on the good wages that were negotiated in their contracts. We're also diverse politically. We have Republicans, Democrats, and Independents in our membership, and that is reflected in the broad array of issues. Next slide, please. So, because we're so diverse, we came to the scheduling issue like we do with other things, because it helped our members were hurting, and we saw an opportunity to help. And we sort of get at the fair scheduling issue in a number of ways. One, we work on implementing it in our contracts. So we negotiate predictable schedules in our contracts and with our employers. And we use it to in our organizing drive to, for example, you see a picture here. We had an organizing drive, and we've now organized the H&M shop. And part of their concern and the reason they wanted to join the union was because they lacked predictable schedules. We also do policy work and lobby our local and state officials. And so there you have our local 555 folks out of Oregon who were deeply involved in the fight for the Fair Work Week initiative in Oregon, celebrating that win down there. And in the middle, you see some of our members one with Local 400 here in D.C. and another Walmart worker who came to Congress to talk about what they see on the ground and advocate with their elected officials for better fair policies. So we really come at it from all sides. We're trying to do big national change, but we're also trying to do employer by employer change. And part of that, the motivation there for the union is one of equality. We want to, if we can negotiate this, make sure that there's no difference between union and non-union workers in terms of their scheduling. Our workers don't become more expensive. We also try to negotiate the differences, but equality between part-time and full-time workers. We have definitely seen in our contract fights that the move to part-time work is a way that employers try to divide their employees. And they will say, we will give you your good wages and fair schedules for existing full-time workers, but not for part-time workers or new workers. We also have a concern about health care. We are a union that's self-insured. So ensuring that everybody who is, because generally that's also the break between part-time and full-time, right? If you're full-time and have a good schedule, you'll be on our health care plan. If not, you won't. And then, so we come at it really as a way of addressing inequality, and we've been in the fight at the state and federal level from the beginning on this issue. Next slide. Which leads to the sort of how we got here. So there are two pieces of federal legislation that attempt to address the problems that our researchers have identified and our workers have pointed out. And they really work together. The Schedules of Work Act, sponsored by Senator Warren and Representative DeLauro, which was reintroduced this year in November of this year, and the Part-Time Worker Bill of Rights, also sponsored by Senator Warren and Representative Schakowsky, introduced in December. And there you have some pictures. That's my president. They're the white guy on the left in the tie with Senator Warren when they introduced the Schedules of Work Act the first time. Back in 2017, Congresswoman Schakowsky in the red, and Rosa DeLauro, longtime champion on all work and family issues, sporting her purple hair streak. Next slide, please. So the Schedules of Work Act really tries to get at the fair scheduling issue in two ways. One is that it guarantees the right to request a schedule change without fear of retaliation. So this right to request it, just alone to ask for it and not be punished, applies to all industries and across all regions. And then it also includes a guarantee that you will be granted that request for specific reasons: caregiving, medical, your own medical needs, a second job, or education. So you might not, if you're requesting it for another reason, you might not get it, but if you are requesting it for those reasons, your employer is supposed to grant it. And then it has a series of pay differentials for that incentivize employers to do predictable schedules. So it requires you to give workers the right to schedule in advance, and if they don't, you have to pay a premium. If something is changed without adequate notice, you have to pay a premium. Guaranteed adequate times between shifts. It tries to do away with things that we've seen in our industries, like cloakings, where you work the last shift of the day and then have to get up the next morning and work the next shift to close and open. So it guaranteeing you 8 hours between shifts, or rather than 3 hours of a break, where some of our members tell stories of just going back and sitting in their car. They don't have enough time to go home or the money to go home, take them however they commuted and come in. So there's really two parts of the Schedules of Work Act: this idea of this right to request, and then this idea of premiums to incentivize workers, employers to provide good shifts, or fair schedules, really, not good shifts, because the good shift is all the eye of the worker. And to also put a lot of the power back into the worker hands to negotiate, and to put them less. Lonnie talked about that unpredictability is a lot about control, being able to plan your schedules. So that's the Federal Schedules of Work Act. This is the second Congress that it's been introduced, and it has growing support. Next slide, please. And the second part of the puzzle is helping part-time workers. And so the Schakowsky-Warren bill, the Part-Time Workers Bill of Rights, again has been a proposal that's been around before. It would require large employers to offer available hours to current employees. So rather than bringing in more part-time employees who aren't eligible for benefits, it ensures full-time work for those who want it, and also discourages hiring of independent contractors. It also makes part-time employees eligible for the FMLA, for the unpaid family medical leave, and for pension plans. Previously, we'd also had ACA healthcare in this bill, but with the advent of the ACA, part-time workers have a path there. So this ensures that part-time workers get the hours and benefits that full-time workers can get, and therefore addressing one of those inequalities that we have seen. Next slide, please. So that's what's happening at the federal level. This is what's happening at the state level. So to be honest, none of these bills are going to pass in a divided Congress at the federal level. So you have to really think about, if you're helping people, pursuing things at all levels. And the federal level is important for setting markers and educating and getting broad press. And the local level has been an opportunity to see action. Both previous presenters talked about the success of some of the local laws. So right now there's one statewide and 6 local laws. You can see the states listed there. The key elements, they all vary. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but I'm glad to answer questions on the differences between the state laws. They all target low-wage workers, so they hospitality, restaurants, fast food, and retail. They all require advance notice, some form of advance notice. The time and pay premiums differ, and not all of them have it, but some of them forbid last-minute shift additions or cancellations, or forbid on-call shifts. So there's a difference in each state, but those are key elements that are being pursued in every state. And that's stuff that already has happened. Next slide, please. There was momentum to move forward with more fair scheduling laws in the states. 6 states introduced laws in this 2019-2020 session. Unfortunately, nothing has been enacted because not very much is moving right now, except that's not COVID related. So, but there is movement and coalitions interested in working in this, and I think I'm missing a big one in New Jersey there, which also has an introduced bill. And then one of the challenges we have with passing stuff at the state level is that some states are trying to preempt the efforts by cities. So 9 states have passed laws that prohibit cities and states from addressing this issue. And this we've seen in a lot of workplace laws, efforts to do fair laws that labor laws at the ground, is that states still try to preempt the cities from doing it. So next slide, please. So that, there's been this great research, there's been momentum and intellectual thought put behind federal bills, there's been state success. We have research on the states and cities so we can start to see. But now we are in this unknown new world. And the uncertain future for retail it's pretty dire. You can see this graph here of the just drop off in the number of jobs. That how we have the future of retail, what it's going to look like, what it's going to come back for, and how we can use this momentum to both ensure that people have jobs, that they have good jobs going forward, is really the challenge of our time. Next slide, please. So half of our chunk of our membership has lost their job, but the other half is working. So food workers, our grocery and food processing workers have been on the front line since the beginning of the COVID crisis. They have had crazy schedules, right? They have been the only people in their families working. They've had to figure out how to work full time in these low-wage jobs while their children's schools are closed, while they are social distancing from their families because they have been exposed. And we do not have the support either in our contracts or in our laws to support people in the what they're experiencing right at this minute for those who are working. And so this is another thing that we struggle with as we try to think about reshaping the world post-COVID. Like, what is people are exhausted, people are fearful, and we don't have a solution for this. We have tried to ensure that our workers have access to childcare. Where childcare is open, make sure that the previous income limits on childcare are available, are lifted or amended so that our workers who have to work have access to it. Scheduling and making sure that they have the paid sick days and paid leave they need to be home sick if or quarantined if they're exposed. And all of that is elements of a proper schedule. And also ensuring that they get their schedules even in this crisis, because this isn't a time to take advantage of workers. Next slide, please.
Rachel, just to let you know, you're running out of time a little bit.
Okay, well, I'm at my end here. So.
Good.
So this is what we're asking for, that we think right now will help workers who are working in low-wage and hourly jobs through this crisis. Fair scheduling, as we've been talking about, but also these other measures, and as well as in-store safety measures. We have a whole Shop Smart campaign that I'm going to hashtag at you all to check out. But the short of it is that grocery store workers and meat processing workers are working during this crisis and not getting the support they need or the scheduling adjustments. On the reverse side, retail workers and traditional retail have lost their jobs, and the future in the past when we've had mass layoffs in retail, it's been used to abuse and provide less benefits. And so we want to build something into the structure that protects workers going forward. So last slide is just my question slide. Thank you guys so much for the opportunity, and I'm glad to ask questions.
Rachel, thank you so much. That was really very fascinating in terms of where we are with attempting to get legislation on these issues and the other kinds of protections that workers need now in the coronavirus era. It's now my pleasure to call on Bridget Schulte. She's the director of the Better Life Lab at New America, as I mentioned. It's a nonpartisan think tank. And she works on public policy, workplace practice, and culture, and strives to make sure that all genders and people and of different racial and ethnic identities can thrive with decent, dignified work and time for care and connections across the arc of their lives. I remember Bridget from when she was a journalist. She won the Pulitzer Prize. She was formerly at the Washington Post. She's the author of the New York Times best-selling Overwhelmed Work, Love and Play, When No One Has the Time. And her work has appeared in many vehicles: New York Times, Washington Monthly, Vox, BBC, Harvard Business Review, Financial Times, and so on. She hosts the Better Life Lab podcast, an Apple Top 50 podcast, and she's spoken at venues around the globe and has appeared on a number of TV, podcast, and radio programs, including NPR's Morning Edition and Fresh Air with Terry Gross. Thank you for joining us, Bridget.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'll ask the same question. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, great. All right. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. Well, thanks so much, Heidi, for the introduction, and thank you so much to my co-presenters. I'm enormously grateful for all the work that they do and continue to do. What I thought that I would do, I still identify as a journalist, and so a lot of the work that we do at the Better Life Lab is to really draw from excellent research like that has been presented here, combine that with power on the ground, with story, connect that with advocacy, and really help shape narratives that can shift mindsets, move policy, and cultural attitudes. So this, what I thought I would do for this talk is share some of the research and the work that we've done that really elevates the voice and the experience of what is it like to live with that kind of crazy, unpredictable schedule. What does that mean? And then honestly, the research, the reporting that we've done shows that not only are stable schedules terrible for workers, terrible for health, mental, physical, psychological health, but it's actually bad for business, and that there is a different way to do it. The technology is not hard to fix, and that we can do it. And as Rachel said, right now, when all of these invisible issues have become so visible, is really the time to seize the moment and press forward for change. So if I could have the next slide, please. So this is a piece that I drew a lot of these themes together for, that I did for the Washington Monthly. I'm not a fan of the headline, Why Today's Shopping Sucks, but what they wanted to do was really connect on these unstable and unpredictable schedules to people's everyday lives. Because as my co-presenters have mentioned, this has largely been an invisible issue. People really haven't paid attention to it. Policymakers, there have been fantastic movements on the local level, but it just really hasn't gained traction in national conversation. And so what we've been trying to do is really draw from people's stories, from the reporting, from the advocacy out there, and make a lot of this visible and real in everyday people's lives. And so if I could have the next slide, please. I'm going to start with just a few stories that I profiled on my podcast, as well as in this Washington Monthly piece. This is Ashley Worthen. She worked at Albertsons, or she still works at Albertsons, in Eugene, Oregon. And a couple years ago, as Rachel mentioned, Oregon is the only state that has passed a stable schedules law. And before that law passed, she worked as a cashier. She's a single mom. This is her beautiful young son, and her life was absolutely completely unpredictable and incredibly stressful. She would get her schedule maybe a day or two sometimes before she had to go to work. She had no idea sometimes what hours she would work or how many hours she would get. So she wasn't, when you have a variable income, your bills don't change. And so that would be incredibly stressful. She ended up living with her mother. She lived with another sister who was also a single mom. when she would be called in at the last minute for a shift, and she, it was at a time when her son's childcare was closed, which was frequent, if you work evening shifts or weekends, then she would rely on her mother to take care of her son. Her sister did the same thing, and so the mother was basically held hostage. Their mother was held hostage by their own unpredictable schedules, because then she couldn't go out and get a job because she always needed to be there as backup, because neither of her daughters ever knew when they would be working. And not knowing how many hours you're going to get means that your income is very variable, and so then they wouldn't know if they could pay their bills at the end of the month. So they lived in this constant state of high stress and anxiety that really did create a sense of psychological distress as well as hopelessness. And that's what a lot of the research that Kristin and Danny have done that's been so powerful has really shown, as well as others. If I could have the next slide, please. Kristin spoke a lot about this, but, how unpredictable schedules really impact children and the child care arrangements. And I think it's so important to mention that just once again, that, these early years we're finding through brain science are absolutely critical for laying the foundation for all future learning and cognitive and social emotional development and stability, and creating consistent warm bonds with caregivers is a critical part of that development, and it's a critical part of ensuring greater access to opportunity and equity throughout life. And so when there is so much unpredictability and the care arrangements are so haphazard in many cases, that creates additional stress for parents as well as for children. If I could have the next slide, please. So again, this is from the piece when I spoke with Kristin's the co-director, Dan Schneider, looking at the impact of not only financial uncertainty, but that sense of time uncertainty, that it's incredibly stressful to have no control over your time. And that's something that we haven't really paid as much attention to. And thankfully, because of their research and a lot of others that has been presented here, we're beginning to pay attention. We can have the next slide, please. So what I want to do is take a few minutes to talk about, well, how did we get here? There was a summit not long ago, and one of the panel on the future of work, and one of the panels was when your boss is an algorithm. Well, how did we get here? Truthfully, this kind of unpredictable scheduling is in part a function of technology, but not only a function of technology. This is kind of the start of using big data to try to more closely match consumer demand with labor. And the whole idea was to create more efficiency in the system. We talk about retail being under, and many of these service sector jobs being under pressure, under stress. And so this is sort of an effort to try to as closely match in real time labor to customer demand, so that you could cut your labor costs and be more efficient. And it sounds great in practice or in theory, but in practice it's been really terrible. So a lot of the big data, the whole idea of algorithmic management, it really first appeared in the Second World War, when mathematicians would calculate how many, say, Allied ships or resources were used compared to enemy resources that were lost. Then that quickly it was adopted in business and in management, and it's been used for train schedules, planes, in all sorts of different areas. And really after the Great Recession, a number of scheduling software companies scheduling software began to be used in these kind of retail environments with the idea that you could cut your labor costs. So now you have all this big data the difficulty is to try to figure out what that demand is. The big data is actually not all that great with that. Demand does shift, but they are trying to, they use big data. They'll look at what were your year-to-date sales from the previous year, and how many people did you have working then. And that's sort of a huge marker that they'll look for. But at the same time, there's sensors and video cameras and Wi-Fi networks that when shoppers will come in, they'll track your foot pattern and they'll figure out how long you dwell on certain products. Some of these algorithms use weather patterns and local and regional events or Twitter traffic to try to figure out when people might be walking by a store and try to predict foot traffic. Some use facial recognition software, to pick up on demographics. So there's all sorts of big data that's going into some of these algorithms. But honestly, so much of this was, again, based on the kind of the idea of just-in-time scheduling, like in Toyota. But it's one thing to have just-in-time scheduling and use all this data if you're trying to fit a car part on. It's another thing entirely when it's a human being and a human life. If I could have the next slide, please. So this is what's so important, that it's not only technology that's created this situation, but it's exacerbated by underlying social problems. If I could have the next slide, please. So the other part of this, the previous speakers have also addressed this, is the rise of what I call the crappy job. Again, since the Great Recession, there's been an explosion in involuntary part-time work. Pay is low, there's no benefits, no path to advancement. The whole idea that you would have open availability, that your schedule, your life, your time is not your own, and that the company can call on you to work at any time with very little notice, or even call you in and make you sit around and then send you home without pay. One person who, a retail analyst, likened it to like hours or schedule sharecropping. And he was saying that in the sense that it was good for business, but it actually isn't. One of the things that people don't account for is that when you have unstable schedules or you've understaffed, which is really what ends up happening, then a shopper will go in and they can't find what they're looking for, or they won't be able to find some help. And so what you're not able to account for is this, so that person will walk out the door and maybe never want to come back, or maybe they'll put some terrible review on Yelp. And so while you can measure your labor costs, and that's something that managers look at, you cannot measure these lost future sales. And so this is one of the things that keeps this algorithmic schedule going, but it's really creating a real race to the bottom. Could I have the next slide, please? So Kathy O'Neill, who's the author of Weapons of Math Destruction, she talks about how this algorithmic software is almost designed as if it were to punish low-wage workers and keep them down. And one of the things I'll say about that is when I've talked with some restaurant workers, when they have these few or unpredictable hours, people will say, well, why don't you just get a second job? And the response is, how can I get a second job if I don't even know what hours I'm going to be working on my first job? So it just keeps a lot of families in this kind of perpetual, endless cycle of high stress and poverty. If I could have the next slide, please. And so this is what's important, is that you can program stability into these algorithms. I spoke with people from the industry, and what they say is that it's a peculiarly American problem, that there are other companies, other countries that use the same algorithms and program them differently with different values and come up with predictable schedules that workers have input into. Can I have the next slide, please? And why that's so important, we referenced, the previous speakers referenced the GAP study, that stability is better for workers. But the GAP study also found that it was much better for business, with increased revenue, increased sales, increased productivity. Could I have the next slide, please? And so here's Bob Clement saying it's so strange because the data is so clear. The business case has been made so clearly to the business community. The fact that they don't practice stable schedules is strange, because they said it's almost like cutting off our nose to spite our face. And I could have the next slide, please. and I say that, I mentioned the what needs to happen for businesses is this sense of shifting your mindset. And this is where I see that there's a huge opportunity in making change, because the evidence is there that the change is not only good for workers, so it's not something that management is going to lose from or businesses will lose. It will actually help them with business and make them better and stronger businesses. And that is clearly so important right now when businesses are, we're all in this terrible economic precarity. Could I have the next slide, please? I'm going to wrap it up. So the last thing I'm just going to talk about is there are bright spots out there. There are there are places that do practice good scheduling. And what they do is they schedule with values. This is a picture of Mud Bay. It's a company that I spent time with and profiled in my story. And they said they never want to be beholden or let data drive their schedule. They want to start with their values, and what they value is worker well-being and customer connection and long, meaningful careers. And so that means they have worker input. They give 3 weeks notice to their schedules, and they have creative solutions. And rather than trying to closely match labor and demand, and then if demand drops off, send somebody home, they cross-train so that they can send you to a different part of the store, which is part of Zane Uptone's good job strategy, to cross-train rather than send people home and specialize. So if I could have the last slide, please. So the last thing that I would just end with is going back to Ashley, the story that I opened with. Once Oregon passed a stable schedules law and she had a stable schedule, she's been able to, her son is flourishing and thriving. Her stress levels have gone down. They've become much more financially stable. Her mother actually has been able to go out and get her own job. And she said that everyone is happier, not only personally and their health is better, she's sleeping better, but that everyone is happier at work. And because people have more say and advance notice, you don't have last-minute call-outs of people calling in sick, which then also creates havoc. So there's much more stability at work, and that people are, the work is actually working better as well. So thank you so much. I'm delighted to have been part of this and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Very, very interesting. If you haven't been able to ask a question, you should look at the lower left side of your screen. And before I call on Jeff to give us the questions we've got, I do want to thank the IWPR staff who've made this possible. Elise Shaw manages our webinar series and gets it all together. Leah Woods is our AV coordinator, works in communications and development at IWPR. And, of course, Jeff Hayes is our senior program director and a principal researcher on the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation project as well. And I do want to correct my title. I'm the senior research economist. I stopped being the president last fall, but, a 32-year habit is hard to break. But our new president is Nicole Mason. And I want to thank IWPR for all of their support for this series. So, Jeff, what have you got for us in the way of questions?
Great. We've had some good questions come in, and I really enjoyed all the talks, and my thanks also to all the speakers. One of the questions that came in was sort of about trade-offs. Does offering free child care count towards a way to support some of the instability that just-in-time scheduling causes? Some jurisdictions are justifying just-in-time by offering access to free child care. And is that a reasonable trade-off?
Who wants to take that? Maybe our child care expert, so to speak, Kristin?
Sure. So I'm not sure I heard the entire question, but what I heard was about the trade-off, employers offering child care when they asked employees to work just-in-time schedules. Is that correct? Does that solve the problem?
That was my reading of the question, yes.
Okay. Well, so today I focused on a fairly narrow piece of the consequences of just-in-time schedules. Other speakers focused on some of the other dimensions, the distress, the mental health impacts, the economic impacts. But I think offering child care when you ask a worker to work on short notice does help with child care. So I think it helps to solve one problem if it's a high-quality child care arrangement. By and large, in our survey, we don't see that happening very often or at all. It's much more common to rely on informal care arrangements. And as Bridget was describing, then it requires sometimes a grandparent to forego other opportunities to be available at any time to cover child care. So I think it's laudable when employers do offer either financial support or direct provision of child care. I don't think it's very common, and I don't think it solves all the problems that are associated with schedules assigned at the last minute.
Bridget did also talk about, right, the financial aspects of not having the amount of hours or not being able to count on them and the instability there, and so wouldn't fix that as much. Another question we got was, is there any research happening to look at how new fair scheduling policies are actually improving these outcomes around health, child care, economic security, et cetera? And this person also is curious about what the data are when you look at it by race and ethnicity. Either Lonnie, maybe Kristin, either one of you.
Yeah, I'm happy to give Lonnie first dibs, but I have a couple of things to say in response.
Well,
Lonnie,
I would.
Do you want to weigh in first?
I mean, there is some ongoing research, and Kristin's right in the middle of it, so I'll be happy to defer to you on that. I think, some of these policies are just being implemented now, so we have to gather baseline data quickly and then see what's changing on the ground. And so I pass it off to you, Kristin. What are you finding so far other than what you presented?
Well, Seattle is the place where we have the most information. We did a one-year evaluation that I referenced in my portion of the talk today that had promising impacts on schedules. We are in the process of putting together a 2-year impact report. Those results are not yet public, but I can say that the results are encouraging when we start looking at further downstream outcomes related to well-being, things related to mental health and sleep. We see some positive impacts. But those results won't be public and published until later in the year. And I think it's really crucial to keep in mind the current coronavirus context where we've seen these positive effects and things moving in a really encouraging direction, but we're at an extremely precarious juncture where it's not clear what's going to happen for these workers and these employers. On the question about race-ethnic disparities, we have from our project published some work. Adam Storer is the lead author. He's a graduate student at Berkeley, and there's a forthcoming paper that documents race-ethnic disparities in insecure scheduling. So workers of color, and particularly female workers of color, are more likely to experience schedule instability and unpredictability compared with their counterparts. So there do seem to be race disparities, and I'm happy to share that work with the question asker.
And I would add that the report for CLASP, which is about to be released, finds pretty large disparities. So in the underemployment issue, the people who are part-time and want more hours, not just a full-time job, but including those, indeed, it's disproportionately. It's widespread. It's about 1 in every 9 or 10 workers, but it's disproportionately higher among people of color, younger people, and at least among part-time, also among women, not so much among full-time workers, where men are underemployed even more. But we're covering all that there. That it's hitting them harder, just like everything else is now.
That's starting to get the last question that we have, or I see out here. Would be any ideas how to navigate post-pandemic job search with a ton of unemployed workers that will include many who don't have scheduling issues that they know of, and they're thinking even of workers, even the younger workers who might not have kids yet, but there's just lots of people who have been hit and hurt by the pandemic recession. How would you? Again, this to me was like, where would job sharing policies or short-term compensation type stuff, would that help or not?
I'll weigh in. I think that would help tremendously, particularly that underemployment issue, which of course is connected to the volatile hours and schedules. But I've seen it proposed, and I wholeheartly endorse it, to not only let employers ask to get short-time compensation to their employees in lieu of laying them off, but also when the recovery begins and they can start rehiring people on just a short time or short-term basis, that they can qualify for the short-time compensation benefits. So for the listeners that don't know about it, almost 30 states in the union, 20 do not, but as part of their unemployment insurance program, people that have reduced hours and didn't lose their jobs outright can get partial compensation to compensate for the hours and the income that was lost by being put on short work weeks. So it would be interesting to extend that because the take-up rate is very low on that. But to extend that to people as they're being rehired, I think would be really important, especially as we come out of this only gradually, where we're going to have these erratic schedules on and off, and just short work weeks for the people who used to be full-time and even people who used to be part-time.
Rachel, does the union support those sorts of policies, or if you're allowed to talk about that? How would that be viewed, I guess?
Work share, we really are talking about work share, but it has to be done right and not be used as a way to keep everybody off of other benefits. And so one of the challenges is these days we still tie our health care and pensions to a certain number of hours. So we don't want employers to game the system and use it again to prevent people from getting other benefits that they're owed. So there's a dance that needs to be done, and we definitely want to be a part of it.
Thanks. I think maybe this one Bridget might have a good answer for, but much of the scheduling research focuses on retail, restaurants, and those kinds of jobs. Are there comparable initiatives in healthcare and domestic work? Is schedule uncertainty less of a problem in these fields?
So that's a great question. So the algorithmic management really took off, and so the problem is, I would say, the largest in the service sector, in retail and in restaurant. Some of that hourly work. In the domestic work and the care work, some of that work is also very unpredictable, and some of it is simply by the nature of it. If you're a home health worker and you have a certain number of clients and one of them passes away, or the situation changes, or they don't need to see you, it's very much kind of client based. Your schedule can be affected, and that can be unpredictable. And I know there are some unions and some agencies who are trying to work to try to find ways to smooth those hours, do some work smoothing. But I do think that is an issue in the care work. I would say in the health profession, say for nurses, there is unpredictability, but the more education you have, the higher you go in sort of in terms of professionalized work, the more say you have in some of that flexibility, which gives you a sense of control and choice, which does reduce the sense of anxiety, uncertainty, and stress. So I think part of the question we need to be thinking about, again, as we come out of this COVID crisis, is how do we how do we create better jobs? How do we make the jobs that already exist that have become so terrible, how do we make each of them better jobs? Because we've seen how they're essential. How do we show that value now?
This is Lonnie. I'm going to weigh in that not only do nurses or other professions experience that volatility a little bit differently, they're also on salaries, so their incomes don't fluctuate along with their hours so much, and they often go into that range of being overemployed, and we're seeing an uptick in that when we did the survey in Illinois for the end of 2019. But the Chicago Fair Workweek Ordinance actually covered, except for safety net hospitals, people in healthcare. So it'll be an interesting situation to observe as we extend this notion of who's subject to these fluctuations and some of the consequences from them, to see if there's some sort of responsiveness on the part of the employers to schedule a little bit more with stability, and as a result, some of the adverse consequences might be diminished. So yeah, with so many jobs in healthcare, we ought to be concerned about that, especially now as we can see what happens when they're put on these emergency duties and overtime shifts. But we should be thinking about this for jobs other than where it's just most egregiously practiced. Thank you.
Well, we're at time. Any remaining questions, we'll try to get to the right speakers. Thank you for your participation to the audience, and thank you to all the speakers again. And back to you, Heidi.
I just want to thank everyone for participating, especially our presenters, our staff, our sponsors, and all of you who listened and watched. Thank you all so much, and we will see you on June 4th for the last webinar in this series, and it will be focusing on the Earned Income Tax Credit and what we know about health benefits from that. So we hope you'll all join us then. Thank you so much.